And welcome to the Friday, July 12th episode of On Iowa Politics. This week on the podcast, the latest on disaster recovery efforts in Iowa, a surprise suspension of a state house re-election campaign, and since we're on the topic of candidates considering whether to end their re-election campaign. Hello, everyone. I'm Erin Murphy, the Des Moines Bureau Chief for the Gazette in Cedar Rapids. With me this week are Gazette Deputy Bureau Chief Tom Barton. Hello, Tom.
Hello, Erin.
We have Lee Des Moines Bureau Chief Caleb McCullough. Hello, Caleb.
Hello, Erin.
Sarah Watson of the Quad City Times joins us. Hello, Sarah.
Hello, Erin.
And lastly, but not leastly, we have Jared McNett of the Sioux City Journal. Greetings, Jared.
Hey, happy Long Legs Day, Erin.
I'm not familiar with that one.
It's a new movie starring Nicolas Cage as a serial killer.
I see those trailers or something for that. I haven't seen that one.
It looks absolutely terrifying, Erin.
Good to know. Good to know. By the way, Jared, just send us a signal or wink or something if you're okay. You got the hostage room background going on there.
I'll blink twice.
Okay. All right. Okay, so let's start with some election news here. A candidate this week, surprisingly, and at a very unusual time, decided to end his campaign for this fall's election. No, not that candidate. More on that later. I'm talking about right now, Republican Iowa State Senator Waylon Brown of Osage. Brown this week announced that he no longer will seek re-election in Senate District 30 in North Iowa. That announcement on its own is not necessarily unusual. What is unusual is the timing. Brown stayed in the election through a competitive Republican primary, which he won, obviously, just more than a month ago. And now, after that, he's decided against running in this fall's general election. Caleb, let me put this to you to start. I'm going to be honest, this one surprised me. I didn't see this coming. And again, not that Brown deciding against running for re-election, that's not surprising, but when he made this decision, am I wrong? Did this surprise you?
Yeah, absolutely. You're not wrong. It was a shock. For many reasons. I mean, he, as you said, went through that really competitive, kind of hard-fought primary. It was the most spent on a legislative race in the entire state for a primary this year.
I forgot that was one of the most expensive races too. Yeah.
Yeah, and he raised over $100,000, spent probably close to that on ads, on mailers, that kind of thing. His opponent's campaign was less expensive. He didn't spend as much money, but it was still a fair amount of campaigning, and he came within about 6 points of beating him. And the big issue in this race was around the carbon capture pipelines, and specifically the Summit pipeline that runs through each of the counties in that district. And Waylon Brown has kind of become a little bit of public enemy number one for the people that anti-pipeline activists. He was the chair of the Commerce Committee in the Senate, and a lot of the bills that would have restricted carbon capture pipelines went through that committee, and those bills never saw much of a hearing in that. They never saw a single hearing at the committee level. There was maybe one hearing at the subcommittee level where the bill was killed, and Brown was not on that subcommittee, but he was considered to be holding up those bills in the Senate. So that was very interesting. And then as far as the timing goes, having won the primary, that kind of leaves the district with no candidate, and so the district needs to go through a convention process to nominate a new candidate. Whether there's plenty of conspiracy theories going around as far as what motivated that decision. I don't have any information on that. But
to that point, sorry, real quick, and to that point, Caleb, Senator Brown did not give a reason in the statement he issued.
That's correct. Yeah, he didn't say anything about why he was dropping out. He did say, "I look forward to my next chapter. The best is yet to come." So we're not sure, if he's going to stay in the public eye, if he's going to, what kind of he's going to do after this. But yeah, he did not give a specific reason. But I do know that the Republican who challenged him, Doug Campbell, has, I think, said that he is going to seek,
Yes.
he's going to try to become the nominee from the district.
Yes,
So
he has.
we'll see how that plays out. So yeah, it's a very interesting situation.
Yeah, shout out to Jeff Stein at KXCL Radio in Waterloo. He passed along to me earlier this week. He had Mr. Campbell on his show and interviewed him on it. And Campbell very clearly planning to work the delegates and hopes to be the nominee. But for those of you unfamiliar with the process, this is now in the hands of the local party delegates. So it doesn't go back to another kind of election. It's the local party activists that will essentially decide who this nominee is. They'll vote on it at an upcoming. The state party will set a nominating convention, and that whoever's chosen there by those delegates will be the nominee in this fall's election.
And another piece to mention, and I was told by somebody who's works in that district that the Campbell had there. I don't know if he was organizing it, but there was at least some movement around write-in campaign for Doug Campbell after he lost the primary. And if that got enough traction, that could very easily have split the Republican vote and led to a Democratic win in that district if there were enough Republicans on board with that write-in campaign. So I don't know if that was part of the consideration, but it is something that is going on. So
I was just gonna say that
Brown.
sounds. Sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
Oh, sorry. Did Waylon Brown say, "Oh, I endorse somebody as a successor"? No.
Nope.
No, he is not. Nope.
Mm.
Nope.
That would make things too easy.
Yeah. And less intriguing though too. So we get something out of it.
This is a very narrow search that I'm asking for, Erin. But can you think of the last time that a legislator dropped out after a primary, especially an incumbent?
I mean, the short answer is not off the top of my head, and I mean that seems like the kind of thing that one would remember on this beat, like if it happened. That's not. I forget a lot of things. It seems like it would be really hard to forget something like that because that is just so unusual to go through the primary and then drop out a competitive primary.
Yeah,
yeah.
There probably have been instances where that's happened, but I think in those cases, I think it's probably a situation where the person dropped out either because of health issues or family reasons, or they got a new job and moved out of the district.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, though. I wonder if there's ones that we're just not thinking of. I may, now that you've asked that, I like that question, Jared. I may shoot an email up to the House clerk and Senate secretary, see if they can remember anything like that, or I guess the Secretary of State's office, maybe. I don't know.
And especially someone with some pretty prominent duties.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. A committee leader, a prominent member of the caucus, been around, had a little bit of tenure under him. Yeah. This is highly unusual in so many ways.
He was essentially the third-ranking Republican in the Senate, right? He was the whip, if I'm thinking of my order right. So.
Fourth, right? President, majority leader, and president pro tem.
Okay,
which is Zahn.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah. Fascinating stuff. And obviously, we'll keep an eye on who gets nominated, and then it'll be interesting to see. I think that's a pretty safe Republican district, right? When we get to the general election, I don't think that's a super competitive one. That's probably a safe Republican win for whomever they nominate, but one that we'll obviously keep an eye on. Speaking of candidates thinking about ending their re-election bids at odd times, the pressure continues to mount on President Joe Biden to rethink his re-election bid. And after a troubling showing at the first presidential debate a couple weeks ago, some Democrats are calling on Biden to step aside and make room for another, presumably younger Democrat to run against Donald Trump this fall. Tom, Caleb's have already written about this. Sarah, as we sit here on Thursday afternoon, you're literally about to write about this when we get off the podcast. So maybe I'll actually start a few, if you don't mind. You give us the brand newest information on Iowa Democrats weighing in on President Biden's campaign, literally as we started it before we hit the record button. What happened, Sarah?
Yeah, so Christina Bohanan, who's the candidate for Congress in Southeast Iowa, the first congressional district, she's calling on Biden to end his reelection campaign. She cites that she's hearing from Iowans across the state that that people have concerns that, quote, it seems he is not up to the task of a strong, vibrant campaign that will provide a compelling vision for our future, unquote. So yeah, so that was I was a little surprised by that, but also Christina Bohanan is kind of a candidate that likes to go against the grain on some things. Like when she was running for the state house, she ran against a really long time Democrat who was in that was Vicki Lensing, I believe, when
Correct.
she ran in that primary to get in the state legislature, and that was kind of poo-pooed a little bit in Iowa city circles when that happened. Or I should say Iowa City Democratic circles when that happened. But
Kind of like breaking unwritten rules, right? Like you don't primary a long time incumbent like that, kind of thing.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think that she's kind of gone against the grain, gone against her party a couple times in that way. So I was a little surprised, but then thinking about some of those things, it is interesting for sure.
Well, and she's in a competitive district, right? In this
Right.
election, she's in one of certainly one of the more competitive ones in the state. So maybe that's the this is an example of a candidate trying to show some moderate, middle of the road tendencies. Tom, you've done some previous reporting on this. Where does Christina Bohanan fit in among other Iowa Democrats who have weighed in on this?
Yeah, so Christina Bohanan right now is kind of the first big Iowa name or prominent Democrat in the state who is campaigning or actively calling on Biden to step down. Up until this point, anxious Iowa Democrats expressed deep concern for President Joe Biden's candidacy after last month's stumbling debate performance on CNN against former President Donald Trump, but stopped short of calling for Biden to end his candidacy and release his delegates. They said that they didn't feel that they were in a position to call on Biden to exit the race. But we did hear some harsh words from Tom Harkin, an Iowa Democrat who served 30 years in the U.S. Senate, and wrote in a private message to friends that was later published publicly with his approval. Kind of eviscerating Biden and his performance, calling it a disaster from which Biden cannot recover. Said that Biden stood there with his mouth hanging open, had bowed much of the time, and looked like someone who just wasn't up to the job. That his responses were mainly incoherent, and said that his answers were meandering and gobbledygook. Or excuse me, he said that I'm sorry that he should have went after Donald Trump more, and kind of his meandering gobbledygook responses that he claimed were full of lies, and said that Biden should release his delegates and allow the party to choose a new nominee at convention.
Can I just jump
Go
in
ahead.
there and observe the state of affairs we're in, where you had a brief moment in confusion and had to clarify which of our two main presidential candidates was being talked about when they were discussing meandering and gobbledygook. I'd just like to flag that depressing little note for us all, and please proceed, Tom.
Yeah, no, appreciate that. Whereas other top Democrats in the state wrote off the debate as a bad night and refocused attention on Trump. Iowa Democratic Party Chair Rita Hart, in a statement, talked about how, in her view, President Biden is the only candidate who's defeated Donald Trump, calling him a self-serving convicted felon, and a threat to democracy and Iowans' freedom. Um, as you can imagine, Iowa Republicans seized on Biden's poor performance last week, calling on top Democrats to say whether they support the president as the party's nominee. Sarah Corkery, a Democrat who's running in Eastern Iowa's second congressional district against Republican incumbent Ashley Hinson, acknowledged Biden's weak showing, but said that she still stood behind the president. She said, don't think any Iowa Democrat was encouraged by the debate performance that President Biden gave, and added that she didn't feel that Biden's campaign should have let him debate if he was feeling ill. Purportedly, allegedly, a Biden campaign aide said that the president had been battling a cold, although I don't know if that was ever confirmed or refuted or whatever by the White House or the Biden campaign. Anyway, she said the one good thing to come from the debate is that panic over Biden's performance has lighted a fire under Iowa Democrats. She said that they've woken up and are paying attention, and that's step one to re-engaging all Democrats, especially Democrats in Iowa, to get to the polls this far. But again, wouldn't say whether Biden should drop out of the race. Said that it's a decision that he and his family need to make, not Sarah Corkery.
Tom, sorry to interrupt, but I have some breaking news on the live podcast coverage here.
Are you serious?
Sarah Corkery has changed that opinion. Amanda Rooker tweeted about 10 minutes ago. Sarah Corkery has now called for Biden to step down. So I think Bohanan kind of opened the floodgates a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, the polling for congressional Democratic candidates in Iowa was already not great before Biden's disastrous campaign performance. And if I'm a candidate running, I'm really worried about Biden being a drag on me in November. I mean,
that was the case before all this.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, even because it's gotten so much worse, there's been reporting that candidates in competitive New York districts are worried. So if they're worried, it's not any better in a place like Iowa, where as a Democrat, you basically need every single thing to break right to even have a chance.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking. I was just thinking the same thing when Bohanan announced there's really zero downside for her or any other Democrat Congress in Iowa, congressional candidate what is it, 60-70% of Democrats agree with her. So it's not really.
And any Democrat who was going to vote for Sarah Corkery or Christina Bohanan is not going to not vote for them this fall if they say this about Joe Biden. You're right. That's a good point, Caleb.
Well,
Sarah, you were about this. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, and these are all people that aren't currently in Congress, so they don't even have to necessarily worry about, upsetting, certain people.
Another good point.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just going to say, they don't have like relationships really with Biden or his staff members unless, maybe during the 2020 campaign. But Joe Biden did very poorly in the Iowa caucuses. I don't think he's revered in Iowa. Fourth. And obviously not well liked, at least across all spectrums, according to the Des Moines Register's recent polling. So it definitely, and Joe Biden's not going to listen to Democratic candidates from Iowa who he doesn't know. So I agree with you, Caleb. It seems like there's not really a downside, and it also gets them just more attention. Like they'll probably get mentioned in news articles and other things, get a little more traction on their campaign if they don't have a lot of things going on.
Well, they certainly will get mentioned in news articles in Iowa. We know that for sure, and we got to get this podcast done so we can get those news articles written. That's amazing, by the way. That
we also got to get this.
Out.
We also got to get this done before the other two Democratic candidates make statements.
We're gonna have to have a funny edit on the YouTube version, and also Ryan Melton. things changing right before our eyes. How about that? What a news cycle. All right. Well, obviously, another one to monitor as we move forward and see if more and more. I mean, this is an interesting thing to think about nationally too. Like, if they're starting to move here, like, I wonder how many more Democrats we'll see in making this call, and then the big question is, are there enough of these that Biden, he and the campaign have seemed pretty defiant so far. Will that change now? And the one thing I should note as a programming note is he has that news conference scheduled for Thursday night. So what you are listening to right now is us talking on Thursday afternoon. So if anything big happens Thursday night, we apologize for that not being part of our discussion here, but that'll take place after we're well and done with this podcast. All right, let's finish up this week and take a little small step off the political trail. And I think we've earned that at this point, and talk about the latest flood recovery efforts in Iowa. Governor Kim Reynolds has been busy this week, again, touring the various Northwest Iowa communities that have been ravaged by flooding. Again, it's Thursday afternoon. I just came from earlier this morning. Reynolds and a number, I lost count, I think it was 8 or 9 state agency directors all participated in a news conference where they all gave a kind of a debriefing on the latest efforts by the state and the agencies in cooperation with federal government. But Jared, describe the latest. You're in the area that was hardest hit by the flooding. What's sort of the latest headlines in Northwest Iowa?
Yeah, so we are still very much in recovery mode. They're like up at the Iowa Great Lakes, the water levels are still higher than they should be at this time of year. Numerous people in Sioux City and Spencer and Cherokee and elsewhere are still unable to get back into their homes. In Correctionville, which is just down the road from Sioux City, there were at least 152 homes that were damaged by floodwaters, and there's only a couple of hundred homes in the town, so that's a staggering number to be damaged. In Spencer, which was one of the hardest hit, at least 40% of the homes in the town were impacted by floodwaters. So, that's a lot of upheaval and shock and displacement. And so, to counteract that, FEMA and other response agencies have been setting up recovery centers in cities such as Spencer and Rock Valley and Rock Rapids and Sioux City. And as you mentioned, Erin, Governor Reynolds has been visiting the various communities, often with FEMA agents. When I was in Cherokee, she had a FEMA agent with her to survey damage and see how the response was going. And she's been to a few places, including Spencer and Rock Valley, multiple times now, including today. She still hasn't officially been to Sioux City yet, and that's actually caused some consternation. Journal reporter Dolly Butts reported that residents at the weekly city council meeting on Monday questioned why Reynolds hasn't visited their homes and wondered when FEMA would be coming. And Sioux City's mayor, Bob Scott, said, I believe that would be a good question for you to ask the governor. I expressed my concern that when I watch the news and the DOT's cleaning up one town and the guards in another town and I get no help here. The governor is well aware of my feeling, I can tell you that. So that's the latest on the response front and on the politics front, I suppose.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
And to your point about the housing, that was I mentioned the news conference I was at this morning. That was the major focus of a couple of new programs that they've been set up. You mentioned FEMA's kind of responsible for the temporary or emergency shelter housing efforts, and the state is trying to find some ways to think about transitional and into long-term, more permanent housing, and coming up with some new grant programs. And one of the ones that was actually genuinely interesting is that you mentioned the FEMA agent that travels around with Governor Reynolds, and she described it as during one of her conversations, the agent just kind of happened to mention this program that is used in hurricane states, and that Iowa is trying to now adapt and get federal approval to use for these flooding events, as just another tool in the toolbox for helping these communities recover. I had hoped to ask the governor about Sioux City, and I didn't get a chance to. It was a chock full press conference, and I didn't get my question snuck in. But that is interesting that you got local leaders actually talking about it.
Yeah, and they're definitely going to need as many tools in the toolbox as possible because, as is the case in a lot of places, there is a housing shortage in a number of communities around here. So when you take a bunch of houses off the market and those people need to find new places to live, that's a real uphill battle to be fighting.
Yeah, and I think this is what you were saying. There was a housing shortage before all of this happened, and yep, and now it's obviously just exacerbated. Sarah, when last we cast pod, you had said that the projections showed the Mississippi River would rise in the Quad Cities, but not flood. Do I remember that right? And is that what happened?
Well, it wouldn't. It would be like an ordinary flood, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Not like a disastrous Sioux City level flood. And it has. I should have been outside doing the podcast from our parking lot because we can see the river in our parking lot. So it has gone up a little bit higher than what was initially predicted. Initially, it was about an 18-foot flood. It actually is crested about 20 feet. And so that causes some disruptions for travel. So River Drive out in front of our office is closed. And there are some, the Salvation Army set up a few spots where people can pick up bottled water who may be on private wells. So if that water rises above their private wells, they won't be able to access that, or it could be contaminated. So they do have some measures in place to help people out, but this is not a record-breaking flood, and residents are kind of just rolling with it.
Okay. Yeah. Obviously, I mean, it's always concerning, but not to the degree of what we're seeing in the other areas of the state.
Correct. Yeah. So it's about 20, it crests about 20.1 feet, and the record is 22.7. So.
Yeah. Okay. All right. That should wrap it up. It was another meaty news week and news day. I didn't have time to get to some other interesting things, including more oral arguments on the hemp products law. The child labor legal battle continues. Never short of stuff to talk about it. So we'll get to those things as soon as we can in future episodes. But that's it for this episode of On Iowa Politics. As a reminder, if you're not already, please subscribe to us on your streaming service of choice or on YouTube, where we also invite you to smash that like button. You also can find the podcast each week on your preferred Gazette or Lee newspaper website. And now that you listen to the On Iowa Politics podcast, make sure you're also subscribed to the On Iowa Politics newsletter, where every morning in your inbox, you'll receive all the latest politics and government coverage from our team. You can subscribe to that free newsletter at the Gazette's website, thegazette.com. And lastly, don't forget that the work of everyone you heard here today can be found on the pages and websites of the Quad City Times, Muscatine Journal, Cedar Rapids Gazette, Waterloo Cedar Falls Courier, Mason City Globe Gazette, Council Bluffs Daily Nonpareil, and the Sioux City Journal. For Tom Barton, Caleb McCullough, Sarah Watson, Jared McNett, Todd Dorman, and our special guest producer, Liz Kennedy, I'm Erin Murphy. Thank you for joining us.